Who are you? Beneath the expectations, the labels, and the societal conditioning, what does it truly mean to become you? I'm John Fleming, the founder and lead practitioner of Becoming You. I created Becoming You out of a desire to share my own experience of becoming myself and to support others who are curious about who they are. From a young age, I have been driven by a desire to figure out who I am, why I'm here, and how I can belong while being myself. This is Becoming You, the podcast. Conversations about uncovering, embracing, and being your true self. A place where I dive deep into what it means and what is required to live life as your most authentic self. Through real, honest, and grounded conversations with professionals and people who are walking the path. If you're curious about identity, authenticity, and personal freedom, your own or others, you're in the right place. Let's dive in. Welcome to the podcast, Vanessa. Do you want to say a few words to introduce yourself?
My name is Vanessa Lacey. I am a Waterford woman and a proud parent and a very proud Waterford woman. And I suppose rather than go too deep into who I am now, I think maybe we'll tease that out over the next few minutes. So let's keep it short. I'm a Waterford woman who's a proud parent.
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, so you're my next door neighbour in Cork. Good to have you with me on the podcast, Vanessa. I have a question for you from the last guest. And that episode was about your relationship with your body and your identity. And her question was, where do you find safety in your body?
Where do I find safety in my body? Oh, my initial thought there just jumped into my head is maybe my gut. I think really my gut is my center point, my main part. A lot of rubbish go into it, but I think I kind of trust or tried to trust my gut at that time. So I think rather than maybe my brain, I tried to trust my gut.
Yeah, I like that. Me too. I often find myself placing my hand on my belly button or that area to really actually connect with it, and I find safety there as well. I think our gut and our gut instinct is super useful. So this is the Becoming You podcast, and I'm really curious for you to share more about who you've been becoming in your life.
I suppose for me, as an English comedian, you say I was born at a very young age. So I was born in 1964 in Waterford City. And my gender and my sex was identified at birth as male. And I was given a male name called after my father's uncle. That was the start of my becoming me, I think, really. So I think, from a very young age, the label of being a boy, I don't think I fitted into that bracket. And I think for most of my experiences of being a young child, I spent playing with the girls, and my expression was quite feminine, which was frowned upon by my parents. And not as much from my mom at that time, but more so from my dad. And I love both of them. But I think really that form of expression in the 60s in Ireland was maybe not the done thing. I look back at that and I think it was a form of safety. I think if I had persisted, I suppose, maybe with my gender identity and expression at that time, looking back now, knowing what I know now, potentially I could have been institutionalized at a very young age. And look at the damage that potentially would have done. So I suppose I give thanks to my parents who are both dead now. And I also give thanks to that little boy that kept me safe for all those years. I left school at 14 years of age with no education because I couldn't retain any information at that time because of the chronic stress I was under. And also, as much as I was experiencing that major difficulty or from my gender identity and how people perceive my gender and how I have to act and how I have to behave and the facade that I had developed, it was very wearing So it's hard to retain information when you're in a situation where you're trying to live in a facade. So I think really I can understand why I left school at 14 years of age. So it was a difficult time, especially with puberty and adolescence and pretending. And fast forward maybe to when I was 43 years of age, to when I was married to my wife at that time for 14 years. My two young sons at 7 and 11, and I was planning on how I would kill myself. And I think at that point, I suppose really what kept me alive, John, was what kept me alive was my children had no part in in them becoming themselves and them living their lives and their birth. But I had a role in that. And I could not disenfranchise them by killing myself and taking myself out of their lives. And I needed to face up to the situation. To be quite honest, I was lucky enough at that time to access a psychotherapist through an LGBT organization and one specific person, I suppose, called Cecily Marr, that connected me with a psychotherapist. And from that time, I engaged my mental health. And it was the first time somebody listened to me. It was the first time someone listened because it was always inside my head or but inside my relationships. And then that personal connection is there. It's not going to go anywhere because there's too much invested in those relationships to look really more objective at what the situation was. Whereas the psychotherapist who was called Mandy supported me to develop coping strategies and resilience to, I suppose, being like a salmon swimming upriver. I was very much going against the grain in terms of deciding to socially transition in Waterford in 2007, 2008, and on from there. So I think really my background, I suppose, forged or provided a platform, which it always does, I believe, with people. I mean, I wasn't born at 43. I was born at 0 in Airmount Maternity Hospital. So, like, I have a history, which I'm very proud of. I think most of us, we all make mistakes sometimes, but we can go back and change our past. We all make mistakes. It's nice to go back sometime and kind of look at them and think, well, maybe I could have done that a little bit of a different way. And what we are, what we are. And the famous counseling technique, or I did my best at what I had at that time. I think whilst that has good value, I think also it's kind of like a get out of jail free card. So like sometimes we do fuck up and we need to kind of go back and maybe address that somewhat. So that's kind of a little bit of who I am, I suppose. As I said, I left school at 14. At 43, when I started gender transitioning, I felt that I needed to understand more about me and then understand more about people in a similar situation like me, and then understand family reactions to people like me when we come out, and why that reaction from my family was so negative, not from my children, but from my family of origin. And I spent a lot of time, I suppose, trying to understand that and support other families in that endeavor. And, you know, through the work that I would have done with a transgender organization called Penny, Transgender Equality Network Ireland, from 2010, allowed me to do that support work with trans people, allowed me to do that support work with incredible families that were on all different levels of their own journey and just needed to, just similar to what I needed, to be listened to and for them to be able to find meaning and discover new hopes for their loved ones. And then in terms of the trainings that I developed and delivered to professionals throughout the country, and not just in the country, I've delivered workshops and presentations and trainings to people in different countries as well. So I'm very proud for the most part to say that that was my job. I think certainly my core in terms of being a trainer and an educator is the other part. In terms of the advocacy work, I certainly was involved with gender recognition in Ireland. I was very much involved in working in terms of healthcare, both in terms of training health professionals, but also in advocating and working with HSC management and leaders to develop trans healthcare in Ireland. So kind of that's who I am, who I was,
Yeah.
who I am, who I was, I suppose it was. Yeah.
Yeah, those are even interesting things, aren't they? The use of language, you know, because identity is a delicate thing and how we choose to use words really matters. So just even picking up on that, you can't be too flippant about it, can you? Like, it does require a moment like you just did there where you kind of check with yourself and think, is it who I was?
Absolutely. I think I try to lead my life as in it's a journey. It's a journey of discover or journey of becoming. There was a quote that I still use from Carl Rogers. I'm not sure if you're aware of Carl Rogers, who
Mm.
would have developed the humanistic perspective in terms of counseling and psychotherapy. And he has one particular quote, it's a very long quote, around becoming yourself in terms of a river. A river is not stagnant, it's always going through the rocks, going through different parts of fields, and it's in a stream of becoming. And this is why I say I was, because I was at that juncture, I suppose, in terms of a stream at that time at different parts of my life and different periods in my life. I probably was blocked by rocks or mud or a dam or something in terms of not being able to become the person that I am now. And I suppose the person that I am now is very different, I suppose, or somewhat different to what I was at 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 or even back in 2007. Like people would say sometimes, oh, I've fully transitioned now. And I think, what the fuck is that all about? It's like, I mean, life is a transition. Life is a transition. I think for me, I had to make a very difficult decision in 2007 to gender transition, to transition my gender to align with my my nature. I suppose we're a mixture of nature and nurture, and my nature that I've hidden since I was a young child, I have to allow to come through me and to be visible to other people. And people had difficulty, I suppose, with that source of becoming, with that nature coming out in me, because people see us in different box. We see people through our own schemas in terms of what we understand people to be and people's schemas, especially the closest people to me, my parents, my brothers, and my sons, and my wife at that time, would have saw me through a schema. But my schemas were just not aligned, and I wasn't able to live that life. And people say, oh, like, that's more woke rubbish. That was woke rubbish that nearly killed me. Because the alternative for me was to end my life because I could not go on to the next step. I felt I was making everybody else miserable because I was not living as my nature, but just my nurture. But I think in terms of having to be myself then did have negative connotations for them and by association then for me. But for me then to live authentically with my nature allowed me to flow again. I think I was certainly blocked, but allowed me to start flowing. But there was lots of times on the way because society did not have that insight in terms of people in situations like I was, in terms of having a conflict and a confusion around my gender identity and the assigned gender, I suppose, because of my sex that I was supposed to live my life. So
Mm.
I swam against that stream, uphill, up mountain for the last 17, 18 years now. And I think for me, one of my favorite films is that film A Wonderful Life from James Stewart. And I feel that I'm the real Harry Bailey. I suppose I'm in becoming myself. For me, I actually love myself.
Good.
Not in a narcissistic way like Donald Trump, but I actually love myself. And I love my boring life. I have the most boring life, but most wonderful life that I could have ever have imagined. I got rid of a television when I started gender transitioning because I knew that if I had kept that television, I would have never put myself into books. I would have never completed my studies because I was working full time with Tenny. And I went on to what I didn't mention is when I started gender transitioning, I went to a guidance counselor. And out of that, I did a year's foundationing in counseling and psychotherapy. Went on to do a BA in psychology. And halfway through that psychology degree, I started working with Tenny. And halfway through working with Tenny, I went on to do a master's and transferred my data to a PhD and graduated with a PhD in 2021. And certainly I would have never imagined that leaving the school at 14 years of age. At that 14-year-old who kept me safe at that time, to think that having failed all those exams and being called a complete fucking agent by my father on many occasions to gender transition and live my nature of being the person that I am, and I suppose a female person, and Vanessa Lacey, and as much as I was not never nurtured as a female, I lived 4 decades as male, so nurture is a massive part for me in my life. And when I would have gender transitioned, I would have thrown the baby out with the bathwater a little bit. But
Mm.
I thought like I missed that baby a little bit too much. So life is a mixture of nature and nurture. And I think
Mm.
for me, that's how I live my life. I live my life in terms of my nature, in terms of that femininity, but that nurturing in terms of that masculinity. I'm also a dad and a very proud dad. And yeah, I mean, I live my life to the best of my ability. I think I try not to put barriers in my way or labels in my way. I try to become that person until the day I die. And I think the person that I am now, today, here in front of you, if I live maybe for another decade, and hopefully I do, and I hope I have quality of life to be able to do that. Maybe if I reach 70, and hopefully I do, and hopefully I get to share the experiences with my family and especially my sons, and have that really good quality of life and simplicity. Simplicity. I
Mm.
think that's a key for me.
That link you made back to your 14-year-old self, and the fact that when you graduated as a doctor, because you're Dr. Vanessa Lacey, and how you left school at 14 feeling, I'm picking up from the way you described, feeling quite oppressed.
Absolutely. I think it was out of survival. I think I
Mm.
had to oppress myself out of survival. And my parents, I suppose, oppressed me psychologically, not physically, because they wanted me to survive. And I suppose their perception of transgender people back in 2007, I suppose I can't speak for them, but maybe I think a lot. And I would think maybe that was to protect me, that they would perceive that trans people have a more difficult life, which they would have been correct with that in terms of the stigma and the
Mm.
barriers that we experience as a community. So it is not an easy decision for people to decide to gender transition. So I stopped oppressing myself in 2007 and very much of saying that my dad often had was fuck the begrudgers, and I fuck the begrudgers, and I live my life in the best way I can without
Mm.
putting labels and barriers on me, and I try to flow like that river, and I hope I can keep flowing.
Mm. Lovely. And not only are you doing that for yourself in your own life and expressing your authenticity and exploring the changes that come as life moves forward? You've done a huge amount of work in Ireland, and I'm sure in other places too, around raising awareness, advocacy, training, quite a lot of work with the health service and advocating for policy change and for services.
I think my experience of the injustices, I suppose, at that time, and I include the injustices in terms of how I was seen by my family, really, in terms of the negative reaction that I had to coming out, I suppose, as myself, how I saw myself, not maybe how they saw themselves. And I felt that sense of injustice, and I felt that as I said, I need to understand about me, and I need to understand about people like me and how we are seen. So before I worked with Tenny, I would have developed a transgender support group in Waterford, and I'd done a lot of advocacy work in Waterford. I ran 3 conferences in Waterford before I ever started working with Tenny. So my idea was raising awareness. It was raising awareness, it was support, and it was advocacy. That was always my mantra, and it still is now. I have a business now called Gender Care, and it's support, it's raising awareness, and it's advocacy around policy and certainly research. I think science is key because there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation currently out there, as we all experience in 2025. And I'm not even going to say Ireland, I'm going to say the world. And so I think, that work has to go on. And I think for me, I've seen myself as being quite privileged to be able to work for an Irish trans NGO at that time in terms of Tenny. And I felt then, because of that privilege, I needed to be a leader, I needed to be a representative, and need to put my hand up to other people who were coming behind me, and to support them and to help them, and to go on the media and to represent them. I think there's a feeling that all trans people have to explain their own existence. And I think that's very unfair to have that assumption that every trans people need to explain their own existence. I think leaders need to be upfront in terms of discussing that and calling out that misinformation and disinformation and telling people about those stories. And I feel even now, I feel I'm a leader and a representative of the trans community, that I would push back on that misinformation and disinformation and stick with the science, but also maybe in terms of I'm in control of my own personal experience. So in terms of I share my personal experience to try and give people a better insight and understanding to my human life. I mean, that's all I am. I'm a human being. For some reason, I was born, I believe, with a conflict between my gender and identity and my sex assigned at birth. So I feel that, and very much it wasn't a choice at my birth to be in that situation. However, I think I've navigated that somewhat, and I'm in a position maybe to explain that to other people. And I think really importantly, in this day and age, to answer some of them questions, especially some of them hard questions. I think rather than those hard questions being put at very vulnerable people who are in the process of their gender transitioning, as a leader, I feel to be in a position to answer those hard questions. And I feel that's I don't see it as a task. I feel my life is a privilege. I'm very privileged to live my life. And it's a small part of me to be able to give that back, to hopefully be able to get through that bottleneck of that developed stigma that has been imposed over the last few years, to be able to move forward. And hopefully this negativity that trans people are experiencing in terms of these misinformation and disinformation fueled narratives that are out there, to navigate that as maybe perceiving that as a wave that will eventually crash, and we can move on, and people can have those fulfilled lives and become themselves as how they see themselves.
And Vanessa, in the years that you've been doing that advocacy work and raising awareness, what, from your perspective, and there may not be one, but if there was, what seems to be the central theme that comes up that you're continuously challenging that allows people to come into a place of acceptance and embracing trans identity rather than trying to push it away?
Yeah, I think in a nutshell, it's that term woke rubbish. I think over the last few years, I think people are confused. I suppose I can understand why they are confused. If there's something like 70 or 80 different definitions for people who can identify in those ways, I think, certainly those need to be simplified. People need to understand that. Human beings are not ultimately bad people, mainly. I think explaining, as I said, answering some of them hard questions, demystifying some of those confusions, I think is key. And kind of like talk about those different languages and how they were developed and why they were developed. And I don't talk about 70 or 80 different definitions. I don't have that time. And I don't know half of them anyway. So I think, and you don't have to know them all, being able to understand that people have lives, and because of, whatever happened in their lives, and they need to transition in different ways. And we all have done. We've all transitioned. I mean, I've gender transitioned, but I've transitioned. I mean, gender transition is a very small part of my life now. I'm just a human being, and I just get on with life.
Yeah.
But I think trying to face those questions, and those hard questions is a key thing in terms of that woke rush, and in terms of the language, the definitions, the pronouns, the medical interventions, and the total misinformation about younger people, especially children, and that there's no medical interventions for whatsoever. That unwoke rubbish, I suppose, in terms of not pushing back in a fighting way, but in terms of sitting there and explaining, well, these are the facts here, and I can provide references to back up this argument, put it in a personal package for them as well, that people can connect with another human being, which is
Mm.
often difficult over social media because they're faceless people. You don't see people. But mainly my experience of working face to face with people, in terms of, while there might be some conflict in terms of our understanding of trans people, that when we have this conversation in a human way, eye to eye and face to face, I think it can enact that change in attitudes.
Yeah. I love what you said around, I don't know them all, because I think people get caught up on that. It's like I've said to someone before, it's like, well, I don't know everyone's name in the world. But usually if I meet somebody and I don't know them, I'll ask them what their name is. And I think we need to become more comfortable as well about asking about other identity markers. Like, it's okay for me to say to somebody, and how do you identify, or how do you like to be identified? Like, for me, that's an absolutely okay thing to say to somebody. Now, I appreciate I've also gone on a journey with that because I worked with the trans community for a while and I got comfortable having those conversations, or more comfortable anyway. But people often say to me, John, how do you do it? You've become an expert. And I'm like, no, no, no. First of all, I'm a cis man. I am not an expert. I am just open to having conversations with people. That's what it's about. It's about meeting people where they're at and being comfortable having conversations like, how would you like me to identify you? This idea that you need to know it all in advance and have it learned off by memory is farcical.
Absolutely. We're facilitators of change, and you would like to see that as positive change rather than negative change.
So, Vanessa, as we come to the end of the conversation, what would be your parting sentiment for people who might be listening in and who are now reflecting on gender identity, their own or others that they are friends with or in a relationship with, or family members? What would be your parting statement?
When you say parting, I thought for a second I was dying, and that you had some information I didn't have. So
Just for this episode, not for your life.
I think for people who are potentially going through that process in the current climate, which is quite negative, and maybe contemplating maybe self-harm or going forward. I think to go and talk to people, I think that's a key thing for you to do, that you need to go to talk to professionals who are educated in this area, to be able to speak out that, to speak, where you are, to try and figure out, I suppose, to have the information that you need to have about yourself in terms of having that narrative, to be able to go to your family maybe in time then and explain that this is who you are and this is what you need to do. And for the families, I suppose, who might be hearing that news, depending on what generation the person is from. And the person who is 70 years of age and is a parent will have a different reaction potentially to a parent of a 10 or a 12 or a 15 or 20-year-old even. So I think it's for them also to connect in with people, to be able to talk about that experience from their own perspective, that they don't have to jump on board straight away in terms of having all that understanding and knowing all these different definitions. I think it's very important for family members to find new meanings,
Yes.
and to discover new hopes for their loved ones and their relationships together, because we do have beautiful relationships together. And certainly in terms of trans people, in terms of the research, it's very much suggests that trans people have much better psychological outcomes once we are supported by our families. So I think that's always my mantra in terms of trans people finding that support ultimately from their families, but also families need support in trying to understand what is happening with the changes in their family. So I think that's my parting words before I go and get some lunch. I'm not going to die. I hope not.
No.
And
No
not at this
plans
stage anyway.
no plans are afoot for today anyway.
No.
Yeah.
I think hopefully I'll hang around for another little while. But
And Vanessa, do you have a question for our next guest?
do I have a question for our next guest? Maybe, how do you know that you're living a fulfilled life, I suppose? Yeah.
Lovely. I like that question. Yeah, great. Brilliant. Thank you, Vanessa.
No worries. Mind yourself.
Thank you for listening. I'm curious about what this conversation has stimulated for you. Thoughts, feelings, curiosity. If this episode intrigued you, hit follow to be notified about new episodes. I know these conversations are valuable to me, and if you think they're valuable too, please do leave a review. Leaving a review allows more people to discover the podcast. You can scroll down to ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and click write a review. You can also connect with Becoming You on Instagram and TikTok by searching the handle @becoming_you__. The links are in the show notes too. You can also visit www.becomingyou.ie to explore the idea of becoming yourself. Thanks for tuning in. Bye for now.